Hello, and thank you for coming today. My name is Michael Dedora, and I'm the Executive Director at the nonprofit organization Center for Inquiry in New York City, one of the two co-sponsoring organizations today, along with the New York City Skeptics. Today we're here in recognition of the 203rd birthday of Charles Darwin. Darwin, as most of you probably know, is the famed naturalist who discovered that all species of life have descended over time from common ancestors and proposed the scientific theory that this branching pattern of evolution is the result of a process called natural selection. He details his controversial ideas in the book On the Origin of Species. Now, in celebration of this day, the Center for Inquiry and the New York City Skeptics for many years now have put on a panel discussion or lecture of some sort to discuss something relevant to evolutionary theory or generally the celebration of science in relation to the public. Last year we had an event about consciousness. We've discussed in the past things like the fossil record and evolution and creation debates. This year we're here to discuss the evolution of altruism and social intelligence. And so our forum is going to weigh questions like, what can the decision-making skills of monkeys tell us about our own tendencies? How do chimps and human toddlers decide when and how to help each other? Just how smart and nice are our closest relatives? And how did their evolution impact human development? Our speakers, Laurie Santos and Felix Warneken, are going to sit down for a conversation with philosopher Massimo Pigliucci, and then they're going to take some questions from the audience. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Massimo Pigliucci and let him take over from there. Massimo Pigliucci is the chair of the philosophy department at the City University of New York at Lehman College. Before going to Lehman, Massimo was professor of ecology and evolution at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. His research is concerned with philosophy of science, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the tedious relationship between science and religion. He's published over 100 technical papers and several books. His columns in the magazines Philosophy Now and Skeptical Inquirer. He pens the Rationally Speaking blog and hosts the podcast of the same name. His most recent book is Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk. Ladies and gentlemen, Massimo Pigliucci, Laurie Santos, and Felix Warneken, thank you.
Thanks, Michael. All right, so I'm going to be introducing our speakers briefly. The way this is going to work is that each one of them is going to give you a very short, few minutes introduction to whatever the heck they want to talk about. And then we will start the conversation while the cards for question and answers are going to be circulated. And then throughout the rest of the afternoon, I'll go through some of these cards and pick interesting questions or questions that are going to direct the discussion in interesting ways. And we'll go from there, trying to wrap up the whole thing by about 4 o'clock or so. So to my left is Laurie Santos, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Yale University. She received her PhD at Harvard in 2003, and her recent publications include papers on issues like food sharing between consort partners in rhesus macaques, on the limits of endowment effects in great apes, on domain-specific kind representations in the absence of language in lemurs, and on capuchin monkeys' use of conditional probabilities to infer causation, something that a lot of human beings I know of have trouble doing. On my right is Felix Warneken, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard. He received his PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the University of Leipzig in 2007. His recent publications include papers on the fact that parental presence and encouragement do not influence helping young children, on the ontogeny and phylogeny of cooperation, on social cognitive contributors to young children's empathic and prosocial behavior, and on new evidence for young children's understanding of joint intentions in collaborative activities. Please welcome Felix Warneken and Laurie Santos.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak and discuss with you today. So I wanted to provide a little bit of background why we study the things we study and the way we do that, so that we are interested in humans primarily, but we should never forget that we have closest evolutionary relatives, and then in the end, we humans are nothing else but great apes. And one of the major questions is to find out what the similarities and differences are and somehow try to find out what the common ancestor was like about 6 million years ago, and have some speculations about the things that might explain why we are, despite all the similarities, still so different. So we are here together to talk about the similarities and differences of chimpanzees and humans. And as far as I know, there's no parallel conference of chimpanzees talking about that topic. So something needs to be explained here. And so the approach that we take in this field, Laurie and I, just as two representatives of many people, is to try to combine a developmental psychological approach to find out about the ontogenetic origins of the kinds of behaviors that we think are important in humans, to especially look at the fundamental cognitive capacities, we're psychologists after all, that might account for all the further development in humans. And this is complemented by comparative or evolutionary approaches to see what the similarities and differences are that might explain why we develop in the way that we develop, and also try to infer something about the common ancestors. So I was talking about the last common ancestors of chimpanzees and humans, but Laurie's work shows that we can show even further down in evolutionary time that we are not so much different in some aspects from other animals. And so the one major question is, what are the differences that allow this very different trajectory? And one common assumption is that we are just very clever animals, and particular chimpanzees, although they look somewhat similar, are in the end fairly dumb. And so I want to show you this example here. This is a chimpanzee who's confronted with the problem that there's a peanut here in this tube, and the chimpanzee can't access it easily. So what to do? Oh, that didn't work. Let's see. So I don't want to ask the audience how many of you would have thought of that solution. The great thing here is that these chimpanzees, and actually also orangutans, when they do it, once they get it, they keep doing it this way. So this is not just trial and error. And also importantly, they very often do that from trial one. So this is not that they try 1,000 things. They have really the insight how to solve it, and they do it this way. And this is actually just one example, a recent example of many other examples, starting with Wolfgang Köhler, showing how clever chimpanzees are in novel contexts, and naturalistic observations starting with Jane Goodall of tool use in chimpanzees and so forth. So the bottom line is that chimpanzees are very clever, and there are now a bunch of studies showing that when we look at young children and chimpanzees in the domains of general intelligence, the differences are not that great. So maybe there is something special about social intelligence, so this is a claim that has been made, that we should look at that in particular. Another domain is that of cooperation, and especially—
Felix, one minute.
Okay, is an example of altruistic motivations to help others with their problems. And one major claim about this is that this is due to socialization practices, maybe acquiring a moral system, and so forth. And I want to give you an example now from developmental psychology to test these ideas. And so what we did in this experiment is, what you will see is an experimenter hanging towels on the clothesline and then accidentally dropping a clothespin on the floor, and an 18-month-old toddler observing that. And here another example of an 18-month-old. The problem here is that first I put a stack of magazines into a cabinet, close the doors, and then I get to get more magazines. Okay, so these are two examples, and there are now a bunch of studies showing that young toddlers are already helpful, and this might indicate to us that there's more to these altruistic motivations than socialization practices alone. And we have also evidence from chimpanzees that they have sometimes pro-social inclinations to help in similar contexts, and Laurie will present some work on that as well. So the bottom line here is that also, altruism, altruistic motivation, might have deeper roots in evolution than we previously thought. And so, way back, it was an insult to humanity to claim that we descended from an ape-like ancestor. But I think there's accumulating evidence that we should embrace that, because non-human animals are also very clever and have pro-social motivations as well. So we should rather be proud of that. Okay, Laurie.
Thank you.
Well, Felix sort of took the words right out of my mouth, both in terms of introducing the comparative approach and sort of talking about why it makes sense to talk about this stuff here on Darwin Day. What I wanted to do is to sort of give you a little bit of an introduction to why I think this especially makes sense to talk about on Darwin Day, and then give you two problem areas where I think we're seeing some interesting insights into the evolution of altruistic behaviors and the kinds of psychological mechanisms that go with that. But typically when I talk to my undergraduates about this stuff, I like to introduce this kind of work with this slide here, because I think this is the misconception about when you start thinking about altruism and moral behavior in animals, that you're not going to see anything like it, because of course, while we are great and moral species, when we look to other animals, we expect to see animals being sort of red in tooth and claw. And I think there's this misconception that the entire animal world is out there, ripping each other to shreds in very sort of scary, not so cute, violent ways. But the upshot is that most of what we've seen is that that's just not the case. The animal world is filled with remarkable examples of animals withholding the weapons that they have and choosing to be relatively nice to each other. And I think this is the reason why it makes sense to talk about this particular topic on this day, is that it's actually a realization that Charles Darwin himself had about the world. And the quote I'm going to show you now from Charles is, I think the puzzle we're still dealing with as psychologists trying to figure out the mechanisms that underlie these behaviors. So in The Descent of Man, Charles notes, look, of all the differences between man and the lower animals, this moral sense or conscience is by far the most important. And I think Charles had his own reasons for sort of hedging his bets on the moral sense, but I think his idea here is in fact correct. As Felix noted, there's no similar conference talking about the evolution of altruism. There's no similar books like Rawls and the Bible and so on in other animals, and therefore we have to deal with the fact that something about us is in fact different for thinking about how we should behave towards others and the kinds of moral actions we should take. However, as Charles went on to say, you'd be crazy to think that any animal that was endowed with social instincts might not acquire something like a moral sense or a conscience. So Charles simultaneously realized that something about us was special, but also that we should see some precursors in other animals. And I think the exciting thing in our field right now is to try to figure out just what are those kinds of precursors, where are the spots where we see continuity, and where are the spots that we see differences. And the two spots that I think we're seeing the most exciting work in both looking at continuity and differences are first in this case of pro-social motivations. Felix showed you the lovely work that he's been up to in human children. He didn't have time to tell you the similarly lovely work he's been up to looking at similar helping behaviors in chimpanzees. But chimpanzees, while perhaps not as cute as those toddlers, are doing very similar helping behaviors to human experimenters and other conspecifics. In our own lab, we've been taking a slightly different approach to this, trying to see what are the conditions under which other animals will do nice things for others. So here's this setup where the capuchin monkeys we work with have the possibility to pull one of these two tools to give themselves a reward. These little cylinders are delicious marshmallows, which they like quite a lot. Or they could give this guy on this other side a marshmallow, or they could give him sort of a piece of cucumber, which is kind of, just okay. And the question is, given that this capuchin monkey here can get the same reward for himself, Does he care about the other individual over there? Do they selectively give the other individual nice rewards? And what we found in a series of studies, and other researchers have now seen in other labs as well, is that for this species, capuchin monkeys are quite willing to give each another individual the good reward. And impressively, they do that in this case where there's another guy there to get the reward, and they withhold doing that in cases where another guy's not present. So we can say, in fact, the capuchin monkeys understand this situation, and they seem to care about others, have some motivation to do something pro-social for other individuals. Now the question is, what are some of the limitations on this? Are the mechanisms that underlie these behaviors similar to what's going on in us when we donate to CFI, for example, or donate to the New York Skeptics, right? And so these are the puzzles we're still facing. That's sort of problem domain number one. Problem domain number two, I think, is trying to look for psychological mechanisms that might be precursors to concepts like justice and equity and fairness. And there's been some really elegant work trying to look at these notions, whether other non-human animals have similar concepts to we do. One of the neat studies to try to look at this was actually a group down at Yerkes Primate Center, Sarah Brosnan and Franz de Waal. And what they did was to set up an elegant study where these two capuchin monkeys are working to get food from this experimenter. They're trading different tokens with her. And the capuchin monkeys can be rewarded in slightly different ways. The experimenter has good rewards, these delicious, yummy grapes here, and they also have some yucky rewards, these sort of pieces of green peppers, which are kind of just okay. What they were able to find is that if everybody's getting the yucky rewards are fine. But as soon as the subject capuchin monkey sees a case where the other guy gets the grape, and then he gets the yucky reward, a couple of interesting things happen. The first thing is that the capuchin monkeys stop wanting to play anymore if they're getting paid less than the other individual. This is a picture of a capuchin monkey throwing his token onto the floor because he no longer wants to play. Even more interesting, though, are cases that Sarah showed where monkeys, rather than eating this food that they, it's okay, it's a good piece of food, it's just not as good as the other guys, what these guys will do is refuse to accept the reward they've been given. So when they're paid less, an otherwise good reward that they liked before is bound to get thrown on the floor because it's no longer good. Again, this raises the question, what are the psychological mechanisms that are driving some of these behaviors? Is this anything like our own sense of equity and justice? And how could we ask some of these questions? And so with that, I'll sit down so Massimo doesn't have to yell at me anymore. But these are the kinds of big questions I think would be fun to bring up in discussion and the kinds of things we're tinkering around with in our labs back there. So.
Thank you. I'm going to start with some questions to get the conversation started. And in the meantime, hopefully we're going to gather questions from the audience, and then we'll go from there. So the first question I'm going to have for both of you, either one of you can go first, is this. Since we're talking about altruism, well, and I'm a philosopher, how do we define altruism? Since the biological concept seem to be significantly different from the psychological one, shouldn't, for instance, really we be talking about self-interested cooperation in the case of non-human animals? And related to this, what is the difference, if any, between altruism and prosocial behavior? Either one.
No,
Laurie?
not it.
All right. So one important thing is that what we look at in these kinds of studies are the proximate mechanisms behind these behaviors. So I just want to say that we're not making any claims about altruism in the sense of ultimate function, that this really necessarily contributes to negative fitness and so forth. And so what we are interested in, and the things that we can test here, are the motivations, for example, behind that, or the proximate or psychological mechanisms there. And so how this contributes to altruism defined in fitness, cost, and benefits, I don't know. This is not what we can study easily with these young children and with the chimps. But the definition concerning the proximate mechanism is that the subjects in our experiments are motivated by a benefit for the other person. So this might be, for example, in these cases that they go at helping the other with the other person's individual goal, right? So the goal fulfillment of the other person is what's in this case altruistically motivated. So it's not a benefit for themselves. So we have several studies where we manipulate whether the children get a reward in return for helping or not. It does not matter. If anything, it has a negative effect on their spontaneous helping. Or other definitions are then that you perform an act that benefits not only yourself but also another individual. So in these cases of prosocial behavior. So that's the definition that we are trying to use.
I mean, just like Felix, I think we too are interested in some of these proximate mechanisms, but I think now that we've started to see them, the hope is that by tinkering around with some of the behaviors we see, we might get hints as to why these things are there at the ultimate perspective. In other words, why did natural selection like them in some sense, and why did these kinds of things persist in our species? One of the things I think that Felix mentioned is the sort of thing that we've in our own lab have been trying to look at, which is the question of why individuals do this, and do they care about who's seeing them and the kind of reward benefit they get. So one question is, would the kids still do it if nobody was there to notice the child putting out there? In the case of capuchin monkeys, we seem to see that they don't seem to like to do good behaviors if other individuals aren't watching them. And in fact, in the little setup that I've shown you, if you can change the setup around so that one capuchin monkey, the guy who's receiving the food, can't see the other guy, what you see is that the capuchins don't just stop helping, they actually get very spiteful, if that's the right word for it. They actually choose the negative reward more often when the other guy's not looking. And so the reason I bring this up is that we're getting, even though we're studying the proximate mechanism, we're getting some potentially interesting ultimate hints about why natural selection might like these behaviors. Perhaps these are behaviors from an evolutionary perspective that might be for things like reputation enhancement or reciprocation down the line. We're really at the early stages of figuring this stuff out, but I think that's the goal, is that we have a tricky time defining altruism outside of anything we can measure in terms of our psychological tests, but the hope is that we can get some insight into where it came from evolutionarily speaking as well.
We might come back to this a little later on, but in the meantime, I think a related question is, do we have any evidence of forethought in non-human primates? Even thought that may not be organizing Sunday afternoons discussions, and they're not organizing Sunday discussions, as you said. But do we have any evidence, and how could we gather any evidence of forethought, planning in the sense that a human being would recognize?
Yeah, I mean, this might be anthropomorphizing, but I have a hard time watching Felix's video of the tool use task without seeing examples of foresight, right? Analyzing the problem, he has to take a step before he's able to solve the problem to figure this out, right? He has to go get the water. You could probably set the task up even more quickly. They had to do some elaborate thing to open some box to get the water, to bring that there. Depending on how you're defining foresight, that might be good evidence right there. But.
So yeah, exactly. That's one thing, that they leave the problem situation. And there's more work. There's a paper by Mulcahy and Call, for example, where apes are able to save a tool for later use. So they have previously used tools to retrieve food from a certain apparatus, but then they just see that this will be the apparatus that they will work with later on. And then they have to select amongst several tools in a different room which one to save and bring into that room. And they can even, one of individual kept that even overnight. So there is a little bit of planning in that sense.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning this isn't just in the purview of apes, right? So if you look at tool use in capuchin monkeys, in wild living capuchin monkeys, you see a similar kind of thing. So capuchin monkeys actually can use stone hammers and sort of flat anvils to crack open nuts. But the nuts they crack open actually have to be harvested. So they'll often pick the nut out of its area, leave it somewhere for a few days, and then come back to it later. Again, a psychologist would say, well, do they really understand what they're doing? Is it just did they pull it out and it wasn't ready to go yet? Is this really evidence of foresight? But hopefully we can design some studies to tinker away at it. But you see hints of it beyond just chimpanzees, which sometimes we people who work with monkeys and more distantly related primates think people say, it's just humans, and then clever researchers like Felix come around and say, it's humans and chimpanzees, and people are like, oh yeah, humans and chimpanzees, that's cool. Like, that's not so jarring to me. But then you see it in a capuchin monkey, or you see it in a dog, or you see it in a cleaner fish, and then, that's when it gets really scary. So.
Yeah. I want to say, however, on this problem that you mentioned a minute ago, Laurie, of anthropomorphizing, and the issue, because it typically does come up with these kinds of discussions. In particular, it seems reasonable to say that research on other primates is essentially using a behavioristic sort of paradigm, because we lack access to self-reported internal mental states. Unlike presumably human beings. Of course, with human beings, there's the issue that they can lie about their mental states, but the monkeys can't tell us anything at all. I would like you to comment on this in also not only from the point of view of the problems with research in primates and extending it to conclusions about human beings, but actually in some sense the other way around, extrapolating from human beings beyond. This seems to be, to me, related to the issue in artificial intelligence, for instance, and to the very idea of a Turing test. How do you tell whether a computer is in fact intelligent or conscious or whatever? And as famously, Turing said, well, if you can't tell the difference from a behavioral perspective, then you have to assume that it is conscious. It may be a little more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is always the trick, right? Is that we would love to be able to get self-reports from these guys. We'd love to be able to know what we're measuring, and we have to get really clever to set up studies where we think we can actually get at what they're doing, and set up controls to know that we're not seeing some ability that we'd like to think looks like our own, but isn't. So the famous case in our own field is a horse by the name of Clever Hans. So this was, some of you are nodding, so you've heard the story. So this was a horse who was part of the circus. He was a very famous horse because it looked like he understood addition, and people could give him complicated addition problems, and he would tap out the answer to those problems. And everyone thought, oh, this is a genius horse, and so on. Turned out he was a genius horse, but not because of his addition abilities. He was just very good at reading human social cues. And so what he would do would be to tap until people sort of reacted as though the answer was there and that he should stop, and that's what he picked up on. How were people able to figure this out? Well, they set up controlled studies where the person who was asking didn't know the answer, and then lo and behold, Clever Hans could know the answer too. So we have these. I mean, I think this is the kind of thing we teach our undergraduates and teach our young researchers, to make sure that we're not studying animals thinking that we're seeing an ability, but what we're seeing is something else that the animals are doing. But it's very, very tricky, and there are famous cases of results that in our own field that we thought were real kinds of things that we learned later, like, oops, we just didn't do it right, read too much into that. And,
yeah, I think it's true that this is a problem that we will never really know what exactly is going on in these animals, although we have the same problem with ourselves. I mean, introspection is also doesn't have the last word on what actually the process is. And so I think, what we are trying to do in this experimental research is rule out alternatives one by one. So, we didn't show any control conditions, but actually there's always one experimental condition where we're trying to show the phenomenon, and then there are 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as many other conditions over several studies to rule out alternative processes that might be going on, right? So it is, the first one indicates that maybe they're able to take a visual perspective that is different from the other individuals, and then you say, oh, maybe there was some other cue in the environment that they could use. Let's run a control condition on that, removing that cue and so forth. So one by one, you falsify. You're never arriving at the ultimate description of what's actually going on, but you can one by one falsify all these things. And also the one realization, I think, from several of these studies with non-human animals is that we often trick ourselves in believing that some complicated process is going on in humans. And then we see that non-human animals can do that in the absence of language, for example. And then you say, well, okay, it can't be that this necessarily depends on language and so forth. So where, it's still possible that it goes through language in humans and happens to be that way in humans, but that this is a necessary prerequisite for certain things can be ruled out. So that we can categorize things non-linguistically, for example, when we show that this is happening in non-human animals, or that it's not necessary to make inferences, in order to make inferences about absent objects to represent them linguistically, because non-human animals can do, and so forth. So I think this is that's the approach to falsify alternative hypotheses one by one.
Speaking of falsifying hypotheses, so we're talking about evolution of certain behavioral characteristics. We're also talking about, of course, particularly in terms of human beings, culture. Now, the two often are sort of presented as opposite or as completely different phenomena and all that. The question here is, well, how do we separate the effects of evolution from those of culture? And does it even make sense to ask the question that way, or would you rephrase it in a different way?
Yeah, I guess it also depends on what you mean by culture, right? Because if it's culture in the pure, very textbook case of cultural anthropology, probably most other non-human animals don't have anything like that, right? So any work that shows some capacity in probably any species other than a chimp, maybe an orangutan or a capuchin, is probably showing that you can have an ability like that in the absence of culture. If by culture you mean any form of social learning that you can get from your environment, any kind of experience whatsoever, then I think it gets really, really tricky. One of the sets of approaches I like is sort of having tasks that are similar both across other non-human species and across developmental populations in humans, so that you can ask the question, you know, say Felix is toddlers who lack most experience with many of the cultural things we would be relevant, that you might think would be relevant for something like helping or altruism. Then you have our adult capuchin monkeys who've had their own capuchin experiences, but they're very different than the kinds that humans will get. By pairing those things together and asking both of those populations at once, you can both answer the question, what could be uniquely human, and therefore you get there from evolution, but you don't need human culture, it's just kind of being a human, evolutionarily speaking, versus the question of what do you get from being an adult animal, where you get certain kinds of experiences over time, which our capuchin monkeys have. And I feel like that's why a lot of folks end up doing these kinds of studies across both the developmental population, but also similar kinds of studies in non-human primates, is that that joint approach allows you to kind of get a nice window into, well, which kinds of experiences are you talking about? Do you need any of them as a super, super young baby? But given that Felix is somebody who does both of those approaches, maybe you have strong opinions about that. But.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that to have biology and culture as opposites doesn't make sense most of the time. And in humans, it's really striking how much we depend on culture in the sense of acquiring the knowledge of other members of our culture. And in some sense, we're really pathetic when we look at other animals in comparison who can do all these things individually. I mean, they know how to find food, somehow they can learn it individually, and we depend so much on others to acquire all these skills. So I think we have outsourced a lot of things to our community and rely on learning that from the older members of our culture. So I think this is also something that in some sense we always say, oh, we are so great because we have culture, but you could also say, well, you're really weak because you depend on it so much.
Yeah, and in fact, there's some cute studies now coming out of Frank Kyle's lab at Yale and also with Andy Whiten at the University of St. Andrews, basically looking at cases where we sometimes do worse when we're following the lead of others. So they did a joint set of studies with chimpanzees and with children, where chimpanzees and children had this puzzle box that they had to figure out. On their own, chimpanzees and children, when they didn't see a demonstrator, or if the box was opaque and they kind of couldn't, or sorry, if the box was transparent, they could kind of see how it worked, they would do pretty well. They'd sort of use physical affordances, get the candy or the treat out in a reasonable way. In contrast, when the box was opaque, they couldn't figure out how to do it, but they had a demonstrator who did it. They would end up following the demonstrator. Sometimes this was good if the demonstrator was doing something smart, but this was often bad if the demonstrator was doing something foolish, so acting on the box in ways that physically wasn't appropriate or just didn't make any sense. The interesting thing, though, was that the children were incredibly tripped up by this. Watching somebody act on a box incorrectly actually changed the way that children thought the box worked. Chimpanzees, in contrast, were not tripped up. They just used their own knowledge of how they thought the box worked and did it in the most efficient way as possible. And so Derek Lyons and his colleagues have called this phenomena over-imitation, this idea that, yes, imitation is good, but sometimes seeing people do the wrong things can actually get us caught in the cycle of doing the wrong things, and we don't question it. And the neat thing is that other species don't seem to be as susceptible to this as we are, which I think is lots of implications that might be, maybe this crowd might want to pick up on. But.
Speaking of the crowd, I do have already probably more than enough questions to get us to 4 o'clock, although by all means, keep writing them. And but before we get to the audience question, I have one more preliminary one, which is this. So another one of the issues that come up in these kinds of discussion is that isn't a problem with comparative evolutionary biology applied to humans, that we simply don't have enough close relatives. Mm-hmm. And the ones that we do have are actually pretty different, one from the other. In other words, there's not many comparison points.
Yeah. And I think that's particularly a problem for thinking about certain aspects of our cognition versus something like chimpanzees. So we're an incredibly different species from chimpanzees because we're using language and having these conferences, but we're also just different in terms of our social structure, right? are relatively cooperative. Most human societies, you see things like pair bonding, where you see joint raising of children. Nothing like that in chimpanzees. The mating system of chimpanzees is very, very different from our own. When we start studying some psychological problem where those kinds of factors might matter for you being a species that has some psychological ability, that's when we run into problems. And I think one of the interesting things that's come out is that the study I showed you with capuchin monkeys, where capuchins are willing to donate to others, you don't see as robust effects like that in chimpanzees. Chimpanzees don't seem to be as interested in helping others out. You can see it under certain situations, but it's definitely not as robust as you see in some other species. And this remains a problem, right? Because we would love to have all of our non-living common ancestors around to test, but they're just not here, despite looking for them broadly in as many spots.
Any comment on that? Or?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it has to be hypothesis-driven. I mean, there might be certain things that you claim are important for certain things, like pair bonding, for example, and it's not necessarily the case that our closest evolutionary ancestors are the most important species to study there. So yeah, it's really, if you have a certain hypothesis, you should look out for the species that share that aspect in their social environment or in the ecology and so forth. Yeah.
So I'm going to start with questions from the audience. In some cases, I may slightly rephrase them or direct you in a slightly different direction. But here's the first one. Is anyone in your field arguing that language is the only fundamental difference between humans and other primates? There seems to be this never-ending quest of human beings to finally establish that we are really a separate kind of thing. Ever since Aristotle would try, right? We're the rational animals, we're the political animals, we're whatever.
Dan Gilbert, who's a professor at Harvard, has a quote that, you know, as soon as you announce that you know the thing that you think is unique about humans, and you say, I think what makes humans unique is this, then somebody's going to come up and be like, another animal does that, and you're like, don't. So he suggests don't announce it, because once you announce it, somebody's going to figure it out. But I think that for sure, no other species has language like we do. So while that might not be the thing that makes us fully unique in all domains, it's definitely like a candidate thing that's out there. And there are researchers like the developmental psychologist Liz Spelke who still maintain that the fact that we grow up as a linguistic species has a bunch of cascading effects down the line for a lot of uniquely human kinds of things. So I'm not sure there are folks that are saying that that's the party line, that's the only thing that makes us different, but it's definitely still a candidate thing that folks talk about in the field.
Would you
No.
But is it, as a follow-up to this, so I'm always puzzled by these search for a single or even a small number of criteria that are absolutely sharply distinguishing us from everybody else, because it seems to me pretty well understood these days that even a quantitative difference can become large enough that for all effective purposes becomes a qualitative one.
That's right.
Right? So that would apply to language. Do you think that would apply to other things?
Yeah, it could apply to lots of things. I mean, I think there's some evidence thinking about other small differences that lead to big differences down the line within developmental populations. There are a group of researchers at the Yale Child Study Center who have this sort of approach for thinking about autism and Asperger's disorders. The idea is that perhaps very early on, there's just a trait where people who are part of the spectrum are just a little bit less interested in social information and social things like faces and eyes and so on. So all the trait says is you're just slightly less interested in paying attention to that stuff, find it a little bit aversive. What are the cascading effects of that down the line? Well, you stop paying attention to all the social cognitive things that matter, right? You stop learning as well about how minds work, how people interact. You end up getting delayed in language because a lot of how we pick up on language is through these social cues that social agents are telling you, pointing to things, labeling them, and so on. So the idea is that, I mean, we can sort of, it might not be the full story when it comes to what explains autism, but this idea that this tiny difference in the beginning, iterated over time, and to the extent that it affects the kinds of experiences you can get, can have big effects. I mean, my guess is that that's a lot of what's going on in the case of humans versus other animals, is that we start out with some penchant for something, maybe paying attention to the actions of others, maybe being a little bit more socially tolerant, maybe a bunch of other things that over experience can lead to all kinds of cascading effects down the line.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I mean, I went to a conference 2 years ago where it was about human uniqueness, and we were trying to figure out what is the thing that makes us unique and has these cascading effects. I mean,
Well, having a conference about human uniqueness is one.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's one thing. But I mean, there are 1,000 differences. The question is really what is the small difference that makes a huge difference, and so forth. But then during the conference, I mean, it was all fun, but we realized that maybe that's not the most important question. And I mean, I realized that in our research, we more and more try to use this comparative method not to find out what's unique about us, but where did it come from? So that there's a certain kind of behavior that we think is really important, say cooperative behaviors as one example, or tool use, and so forth. And then we want to know what's the origin of this. And so it's no longer a question about human uniqueness, but the comparative method can tell us something about the evolution of that and the development. So in some sense, I find that even more important and dodge the question about uniqueness very often.
Dodging questions is always fun.
Yeah.
The next one is somewhat related, but it takes the problem from a different perspective, and it is this. Is there any evidence that other primates, once that they hit on a solution for a particular problem, they iterate the search for better and better solutions, like human beings tend to do? In other words, do they just find something and then stop there, or is there some hint of sort of progressive learning, progressive way of getting more sophisticated about problem solving?
Yeah, I don't know, you might know better than I do in apes. I mean, I think it depends on what you mean by iterating, right? I mean, it is the case that you see cases of tool use that's kind of, relatively complex in other species. You'd be hard pressed to think that one individual figured out the whole solution. Probably over time, it was one individual figured something out, either via social learning or via kind of having the rudiments of these problems lying around. Other guys figured it out, and ultimately that led to complex stuff. I mean, my answer to the question would be, I'm not sure that there's lots of evidence that all humans do that all the time. Right. So monkeys and other species might be held to a high standard there, but.
Yeah. I mean, it's puzzling. So there's this discussion about cultural learning. Laurie alluded to that early on, and there's a little bit of social learning going on in non-human primates. But what we can say with some certainty is that there's not this cumulative cultural process going on. So I mean, there's one step, and there's acquired from others, but it's not that apes improve that, at least within their lifetime, and then it's learned from others. So this is really striking that we have this cumulative cultural learning. Some people call it the ratchet effect, so that we are at one level and this is passed on to the next generation, standing on the shoulders of giants, and then improving it over and over again. And so there's this puzzling thing: if apes, and several people argue that, have in principle the same social learning capacities, why did they not develop cumulative culture? So that's it's a puzzling question. So and that's why I think it's really striking that maybe they are very curious, they're able to learn socially, but somehow they're not making major strides in improving, for example, tool use.
The next question goes back to something that I asked you earlier, which is the paucity of close comparisons for the evolution of human behavior. In particular, the question concerns our relationship to bonobos and chimpanzees, which are very different kinds of species. Is there any way that we can tell whether we are actually more closely related to one than the other, or what?
Well, I think the gene and Felix we're equally related to both of them, evolutionarily speaking, right? Right. But who we're more similar to in terms of our cognition, in terms of our behaviors, is a tricky question. I mean, one of the big problems with answering the question right now is that they're, relative to the amount of work we have on chimpanzees and relative to the extent we understand chimpanzees, we just don't understand or know that much about bonobo cognition. Felix's colleague, Brian Hare, has done some of the best, excellent work out there, but there's just not that much in terms of understanding how they think about physics and how they think about social cognition. I think this is some of the most exciting work that we're doing right now, but I think we just haven't had as long to study bonobos as we had chimpanzees, so my guess is the jury's still out. But.
Right. I mean, one thing we know from several studies, this was mainly by Brian Hare and his students, that chimpanzees are very competitive over food. So it's always very, creates a lot of tension between individuals when there's food around, but bonobos are usually more relaxed around that. So they can co-feed. There's not active sharing going on that some pieces of food are passed on to the other individual, but where chimpanzees often fight over a pile of food, bonobos can access it more peacefully. And so in that sense, they are more cooperative in sharing situations, but whether this translates into more intelligent cooperative behaviors like these instrumental helping behaviors and so forth, we don't know.
So at least some human beings engage in cross-species altruism. Is there any compelling evidence, well-documented evidence, that other species do the same?
Well, you can see it in some of the natural behaviors that we see in other kinds of taxa. So for example, there's this famous case of cleaner fish, who are sort of the dentists of the animal world. They set up little cleaning stations and wait around for fish of other species to show up and become clean. Cleaner fish are very tiny, so they can kind of hang out there, and a big barracuda or some other large species will show up. I'm not sure I would call this altruism, because the cleaner fish ends up getting something good out of this. He gets a delicious meal of the parasites, and then the client fish gets clean. But if you're talking about examples of cooperation where different species sort it out, that's definitely one of the best ones. In fact, that's one of the natural systems of animal cooperation that's been best worked out in terms of whether it's about reputation, what the client and the cleaner fish are paying attention to, what are cases where the cleaner fish will defect, so actually eat some of the mouth mucus of the client fish rather than just eat the parasites. Those are what are cases where the client fish will defect, which is just chomping the cleaner fish rather than eating. So
you call that defecting?
Defecting,
okay.
Yeah. To the cleaner fish.
I'll remember that next time that I go to the dentist. I'll defect.
Well, I want to mention one example. This is Redwan Shari has observed this. Moray eels and grouper fish going on a hunt together. So grouper fish are open water hunters, and moray eels go through the crevices. And what he observed is that the groupers do like a head bob over a hole where the moray eel is hiding, and making some wiggling, and somehow then the eel comes out. And then they go out together not that they think they're going out together, but physically they're coordinated, and this way they mutualistically benefit from that, because if there's some little fish going in the crevices, the eel will catch it, and when they go out, the grouper will do that. So there is some level of cross-species cooperation going on. Obviously, the assumption must be that this is selfishly motivated, right? But they are better together than one doing it individually.
Right, but that goes in some sense back to one of the earlier questions about how do we distinguish altruism. I mean, most people, when we're talking about altruism among human beings, we're talking about an actual selfless act, not something that you do in order for, because you're expecting something. At the proximate level. Right. Now, the two are not mutually exclusive necessarily in this sense, that it's actually possible to see how true altruistic behavior may evolve either culturally or even biologically out of roots that are actually into cooperative behavior where you expect some kind of reciprocation, right? I mean, that it's not like the two categories are necessarily that distinguished.
Yeah, I mean, I think biologists would often strongly predict that there's reason to suspect that you would never see something that was purely altruistic at the evolutionary level. In other words, that had no survival or reproductive success benefit. What it looks like is at the proximate level, it can be very weird, and the weird behavior at the proximate level can play out in environments in which it doesn't make sense anymore. But the idea is that whatever the psychology is, to the extent that it's controlled by the genes, and to the extent that genes are controlled by inclusive fitness and natural selection, you might never strongly see things that are purely altruistic, like really giving of yourself at the level of survival and reproductive success. Even though it looks like that at the proximate level, what you expect is it has some secret benefit for you, either reputationally or at least in the environments in which we evolved. That'd be the strong claim from inclusive fitness, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I mean, the book is not closed on how truly altruistic humans are. I mean, there are a lot of or not. Yeah, so I mean, you know the many behavioral economics experiments where it's sharing a resource with an anonymous other, and it's explained that nobody will know whether you kept everything for yourself or you gave it to the other. You will never know this other person, therefore the person can't reciprocate, and so forth. But I mean, there are lots of studies attacking that idea, and that there are other proximate mechanisms operating, like reputation-based things, that we are subliminally paying attention somehow to eyes watching us, and so forth. So it's not yet clear how truly altruistically motivated we are, let alone the level of ultimate function.
So the Italian political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli has, I think, an undeserved bad reputation for his ideas, and it often comes up in these discussions. In fact, there's a question here that asks the two of you about what do you think about the Machiavellian hypothesis as an explanation for the evolution of social intelligence in primates, in particular in humans. You might want to talk about what the Machiavellian hypothesis is.
Yeah, so this is the idea that what drove the evolution of our social intelligence is the idea that we needed social intelligence to outcompete each other. You know, we're these sort of elaborate politicians a la Machiavelli, and if we had greater skills to read others' minds, to kind of outcompete others using our social intelligence, that's how we got it. I think that it's always hard to test hypotheses like that, that the evolutionary reason we got something is for this thing. And that's because we can't have a time machine to go back and look at what contributed to survival and reproductive success back in the evolutionary day, which is the only real empirical way, I think, to answer that. Barring that good empirical way to answer that question, we do see hints that the spots in non-human primates where you sometimes see the best social cognition or the most elaborated social abilities tends to be in contexts that are Machiavellian. It tends to be in contexts that are about competition. This is particularly, or has been the case in some work on theory of mind, so the extent to which other primates can think about the minds of others. Some of the earliest successes that we saw in the field happen to be in spots where you are asking a particular chimpanzee or a rhesus monkey to think about the competitor's mental states, and particularly to try to deceive other competitors. Recently, we've been able to see that primates are actually pretty good at social reading in other kinds of contexts, but it's true that sometimes if you put them in Machiavellian states, they do better. Now, does that mean that being Machiavelli-like was what drove the evolution of those abilities? Again, we can't, it's tricky to say because we lack the kind of time machine that we need to answer that question, but there's some evidence that context matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to add, I mean, one important aspect about the Machiavellian hypothesis or social intelligence hypothesis originally is also that we can look at the ecology of different species, and then we see that the pressures are somewhat similar when it comes, for example, to foraging. So this can be that we need more memory, better memory capacities to know where food is, because other animals face similar problems, or it's even more difficult for them. But then we see that primates in particular have more complex social structure, and so this is how the idea arose. And so I think this is very plausible, and then in experiments we try to elicit that, so Laurie is doing that, to show that maybe in competitive context they act a bit more intelligently than in other contexts, indicating that. But the other thing is that I find it surprising that people always talk about competition when they talk about the Machiavellian hypothesis, but the idea is actually that it's the right balance between cooperation and competition. So I mean, ultimately it's all about improving yourself and so forth, but that you know under what circumstances, for example, you should find an ally for a certain problem, and when you should compete. So I think the hypothesis is actually a little bit bigger than that, and it might explain not only our great intelligence in outcompeting others, but also when to forge mutualistic relationships with others.
Still talking about possible mechanisms at the root of human altruism in particular, what about the possible relationship of parent-offspring relationships, and particular kin selection in general?
Well, we know kin selection has influenced the evolution of altruism in all kinds of species, right? This is why, you know, if you look at who tends to be nicest to you throughout the animal kingdom, it's usually your parents or your kin and so on. How much of that?
I'll remind my mother of that.
Yeah. Valentine's Day is coming up, everyone, so email your mom. But whether the set of mechanisms that are driving the kinds of altruistic behaviors we see in humans are the result of those mechanisms, that I'm a little bit more skeptical of, in part because of the idea that one of the robust weird things about human altruism is that we tend to be so altruistic towards non-kin. And I think if anything, we should be looking for psychological mechanisms that are really different than what we might expect from kin selection, particularly for us, because we're so robustly nice to others that are not related to us. So
Robustly nice, I like that.
robustly nice.
Yeah.
Relative to other species.
That's right. It's all
always
relative.
robustly nice.
Well, this is actually from the same person, but it's a completely different question, but it will bring us into interesting directions, I think. Does evolution have anything to say about the question of why we should be nice to each other? And the emphasis, I think, is on should here.
Yeah. Yeah,
As
I
opposed
mean,
to are we or not, as a factual matter.
yeah, unless you think that all your moral concerns should derive from what inclusive fitness tells you, which I think would make you a very bad moral agent, evolution can't tell you about shoulds. I mean, it can tell you shoulds for your genes, but it can't tell you shoulds for you. So
Okay.
I'm going to opt out on the should question. But.
Okay.
The naturalistic fallacy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
We don't want to. Yeah. So I mean, evolution can maybe. Can describe that it works under certain circumstances, and in that sense, in a sense of rationality, for pragmatic reasons, you should do that, but not should in the sense of normative.
Right. Okay. Related to the question of that I asked earlier, the interaction between culture and biology, I wonder what you guys think about the recent book published by Steven Pinker, where he argues, apparently pretty good data in hand, that the amount of violence has decreased in a bumpy way, but has decreased significantly throughout human history. And then about his explanations for that. The data apparently are pretty good. I've read several critical reviews of the book, and the data seems, everybody seems to agree that more or less, with some little bumps like World War I, there were, he's about right.
Little bump.
Yeah, little bump over there. But the more controversial is the explanation. So basically, the Pinker's basic idea is that this happened all in fairly recent historical times, and that therefore it is largely, if not exclusively, the result of cultural forces, as opposed to sort of biological ones. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is I know very little about both the mechanisms that drive violent behavior and some of the cultural influences that might lead to it. So I'd say I'd sort of say the jury's out. I also have to admit now on YouTube that I haven't read the book, which is sort of embarrassing.
Fair enough.
I haven't read the book. So I don't know.
It's big.
It's Felix's colleague. Maybe he's right. No.
Oh, there you go.
No.
I haven't come to the explanation chapter yet. Actually, no, it's true. Well, I think that's how we can get at that. I mean, that's the important thing that we can, and Steve Pinker has done that, to collect all the data to see when these things happen. And I think that's a very good, very likely explanation if it is the case that this happened fairly recently. And I think we have to keep looking. I mean, this is also something that might not just gradually decrease, and then we can make predictions about what kinds of cultural mechanisms account for that. And if they come up again, then see if it increases. So I think, that's the right approach.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I find Pinker's new work interesting is because he's famous for being a strong proponent of evolutionary psychology, and therefore he's been focused for a long time on evolutionary explanations, not cultural.
Yeah, but I think this comes back to the issue that we might not necessarily want to separate these things, because there's also this gene-culture coevolution thing. So it might be that those individuals who are more pro-socially inclined are also better off, and then they can leave more offspring and so forth. So it is the case that culture just enters the equation. So it's not that there is biology and then culture takes over on a different level, but they interact in interesting ways. So when someone says that culture is the explanation for that, it's not that you throw biology out the window. It's more that it's added to it.
Which brings me to a related question about the evolution of culture. So we have a very well-established theory of evolutionary biology. Like all scientific theories, it keeps changing all the time. You know, people are fine-tuning it, and occasionally new evolutionary processes are discovered, and they have to be incorporated in theory. But pretty much, Chuck was essentially right, at least according to the majority of biologists. On the other hand, in terms of cultural evolution, we have seen all sorts of things going in all sorts of directions. There was, you just mentioned, the gene-culture coevolution. That literature goes back to the Stanford group, Cavalli, Forsythe, Feldman, and so on. But those people were publishing that stuff in the 1980s and 90s. I haven't seen much in that area more recently. Then there was, of course, the craze about memetics, and everything is a meme. And my only comment on that is that the Journal of Memetics closed down a few years ago. So evidently, they either discovered everything there was to say about memes, or then there's nothing to say about memes, and so on and so forth. And now, we do have other people working, of course, on these things, but it seems to me that we still, surprisingly, lack a overall theory of cultural evolution. Is that out of the...
No, I think that's a fair assessment, given what I know about the field. I mean, I think there's a couple problems with getting a good theory of culture relative to getting a theory of, like, the new evolutionary biology. One is that it's not clear in culture exactly what the units are. I mean, I think that was the good thing about the meme approach, is that there was an attempt to try to say what that is. I think the problem with that approach is that a cultural unit can be an idea, it can be a kind of boot, it can be like a hairstyle. I mean, it's going to be really hard to kind of parameterize that. In the same way that Darwin leapt into. I mean, Darwin amazingly didn't know what the units were for natural selection when he started the theory. He didn't have Mendel's lovely theory to think about inheritance, but he lucked into a domain in which the units were going to be reasonable and we could make some headway on it. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is I think we don't have a great gauge on what the replication process is like, right? And I think this is not the fault of the evolutionists, this is the fault of the psychologists for understanding, you know, why is it that we choose to copy something? Why is it that we choose to replicate something? What are the conditions under which we do? What are the conditions under which we mutate it, right, to get some understanding of mutation? And all these things are just complicated, so I think that's most of why we don't have a great theory of cultural evolution, is that, you know, evolutionary biology, for all its complications, is just way less complicated than how we change frequencies of traits in cultures across time. But.
Well, following up actually on that, let's talk about psychology for a minute.
Uh-oh.
So psychology is often referred to as a soft science, and that's not meant as a compliment. Although you're in good,
we take it as one.
Right, but yeah, it's in good company, because sometimes even evolutionary biology actually is referred that way, depending on who makes that comment. If it's a physicist, then you're in trouble. Now, it seems, however, fair from a sort of philosophy of science perspective to admit that, yes, there are in fact some major differences between, say, psychology as a practice and, you know, fundamental physics. Mm-hmm. And one of those differences, perhaps the most important one, is that psychology seems to lack, at least at the moment, an overarching theory that sort of makes sense of the whole thing, in the way in which Chuck's theory makes sense of things in biology, or in the way in which, you know, the standard model in physics works. Any comment on that?
Yes, you're right. Some philosophers go after psychologists all the time, but we just know and say yes. I mean, I think the problem is that attempts at coming up with an overarching theory of behavior have often been really bad, right? I think the one that we're now reaping the horrible consequences of thinking is that humans are just rational utility maximizers, right? Which is what the theory that economics gives us, and a theory that helps economists use the good math tools that they have within the context of these axioms to predict how markets are going to work and how humans are going to work. And I think that, you know, part of the failures of some of those models aren't just, you know, failures of the math, it's failures of this idea that we're always going to act rationally. And so I think there has been an attempt on the part of social scientists to come up with the big overarching theory, but we've just been wrong. And this raises the question of, you know, will we find one? In terms of the rational theories, there's a big group of economists now who are trying to, within the context of all the behavioral biases we see, put together an overarching theory of, you know, how we behave and how we can make sense of all the anomalies in behavior. My understanding is it hasn't gotten that far, but, you know, folks are motivated to do it, but we might just be more complicated than quirks and natural things, or we might be too dumb, or we might be too young a science to have figured it out. But.
Yeah, and I think it's actually interesting. We have the example of game theory, that there's a normative theory of what should happen, and then there's that observation of people not behaving according to the theory. So this is actually, it's not a defeat as so much, it's really interesting to see the discrepancy there. So that's another way to look at that. And evolution, and that's, I think, the important point, is evolution tells us that there must be a good reason for this, right? So that there's this tension between what, according to certain axioms, should happen, but we as biological organisms don't operate in this way. And so this, I think, generates more interesting questions and hopefully answers it at some point.
But I want to stay on this topic of just a few more minutes. What about, for instance, evolutionary psychology as a general theory of psychological behavior? What about evolutionary psychology as a general theory of human behavior?
What evolutionary psychology are you talking about here? So I mean,
you could mean what we do, in which case we'll say yes, that's a great.
Yeah. Right. No, I mean things like the Tooby and Cosmides papers, for instance. So you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, they somehow adopted this term, and I mean, we are evolutionary psychologists, but not necessarily subscribing to that particular type of doing evolutionary psychology. So I think, historically, this was a major step to challenge the standard social science model, deriving the ideas from all being due to socialization processes, we being just a general, that they're a blank slate and we just acquire whatever is out there in the cultural environment and so forth. So I think that this was extremely important and an important attack against that, and we have gained a lot from it. But I think what's really important is to add to that really ecological approach, or more ethology, and also the comparative approach with non-human animals. And that's what I find sometimes is lacking in some of the studies that are conducted under the umbrella of evolutionary psychology, that there are some assumptions about what was the typical environment for early humans, and you can't really test that. And that's why I think it's so great that we are able to do comparative studies with other animals to make some inferences about common ancestors. So I think this is one thing that I want to add to the standard evolutionary psychology approach, that we can actually learn a little bit, gather a little bit more data about that than anthropological data about what humans were like in the savannah. And the other thing is ontogeny. So what I have a little bit of a problem with, but I might be biased because I'm primarily a developmental psychologist, is that there's these observations about automatic processes in undergraduates who are mainly the subjects of these experiments. And then there's the inference that this must be something that is has deep evolutionary roots. This is due to a module or whatever, but we have not ruled out the possibility that this is due to an ontogenetic learning process, right? This might be something that is not reflective of that, but is just reflective of the current environment and how children learn things and grow into these undergraduates who then show these automatic processes. So they were not automatic originally, but they have become automatic. So this is, I think that it should be evolutionary psychology in a broader sense than the evolutionary psychological approach that Tooby and Cosmides have started with.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. I mean, the frustration from comparative researchers looking at this field is that evolutionary psychologists often propose theories that are hypotheses about what happened in human ancestry that you could test wonderfully by having another comparison point in the animal world. So to take one example, there's an evolutionary psychology hypothesis that it might make sense for children to look more like their male parents than female parents, because looking like, there's if it plopped out of a mom, you kind of know that the mom is the mom, but there's often some question about whether the dad is the dad, and it would benefit babies to do this, right? But that's only true if you live in a pair-bonded society, or you live in a pair-bonded species like that of humans, right? A strong prediction might be that those mechanisms might not be as helpful in a chimpanzee species, where there's some assumption that the females have mated with all the guys, or it might not be as helpful in a non-pair-bonded species.
So that's been exactly the frustration Felix outlined is the frustration that I often have with evolutionary psychology, where it feels like there's this awesome test case that you could use if you weren't just studying undergraduates, but oftentimes, for whatever reason, those hypotheses aren't tested.
But they're cheap.
So undergraduates are cheap, it's true.
Back to the data. What about altruism in other mammals, that is in non-primates, like recent studies finding evidence of altruistic behavior in rats?
Yeah, I mean, great studies that, my one critique of that new set of science studies is that there was a lot of elegant work looking at altruism in rodents in the 1960s that somehow didn't get much press. I mean, I think this is one of the other problems with psychology as a soft science is that I think more so than physics or biology, we tend to forget the great things that our ancestors in the field have done, and we often sort of try to jump over the shoulders of giants rather than stand up, which is sort of a problem. But lovely, lovely work. I mean, here I jump back to the quote from Darwin that we started with, which is that my guess is that we're going to see mechanisms like this in all kinds of social species. If you're a social species and you face this problem that you have to deal with other social agents, you're probably going to have mechanisms to potentially be interested in their own behaviors, potentially reading their minds, and potentially also doing things that are nice or empathetic to them. The question that comes up is, are the psychological mechanisms that drive those behaviors exactly the same between us and them? For rodents, maybe the answers would be yes. In cleaner fish, in amoebas, maybe the answers might be no. But then it becomes a fun discussion about how different physical processes can actually shape the psychology, and maybe it's the same in rodents and us, but maybe not.
Right. Yeah, so I think one important point is that there may be demonstrations of one type of behavior in one type of species, and what is so striking about humans and maybe also other primates is that we show these behaviors in so many different contexts. And so the problem with one finding one particular paradigm is that there are many reasons why this might have happened. So, for example, with rats, very often the issue is that they might just find it aversive to hear someone else screaming and so forth. So, and they just want to remove the personal distress they experience. It's not really about the other. So this is a critique of all kinds of empathy experiments in humans and other animals, and this has to be ruled out. And so that's always a problem. If we find it only in one domain or in one particular experimental situation, we cannot be certain about what exactly is going on. And that's why it's so important to show that these things happen in many different contexts that are the same on one level, say in the case of these pro-social acts or altruistic acts, that it's benefiting the other individual, not the subject, or visual perspective taking. It doesn't happen only with this kind of visual blockage, but another kind, and so forth. And then we can be more certain about this being actually due to a certain capacity rather than being an experimental artifact. So the other alternative is that the animals or humans actually show it in only one particular context. So it is the real thing, but it's very limited. So we don't know. But these kinds of examples indicate to us that the next step is to vary the situation and find convergent evidence on something before we make major conclusions.
There is a famous quote by Jacques Monod, who was a Nobel Prize winner for his research on biochemical pathways. And he said something on the lines of, what is good for E. coli is good for the elephant. This is true for biochemical pathways. It doesn't seem to be quite as true for behavior. And so I'm wondering if one of the problems here is exactly that it's much, much easier to do homologies from an evolutionary perspective on fundamental mechanisms such as biochemical pathways.
Yeah.
And when it comes to behaviors, not only behaviors are more complicated because in part they are the result of many biochemical pathways, but also we get to the issue of phenotypic plasticity, of how the environment can interact with the genetic makeup of an individual. Would you care to comment about that particular one?
I think that comment is spot on, especially in terms of trying to figure out some of these kinds of complex traits. So one of the projects we've been involved in, it involves our field site on this island of Puerto Rico, where there's 1,000 free-ranging rhesus monkeys who've been studied since the 1930s. And we recently had the opportunity to begin genotyping these monkeys, which is exciting. And we're going to try to pair the information we get from the genes with information that we've gotten from their natural behavior, because there's now over 70 years of work at this site on the natural behavior, and less decades, but some decades on the cognition of these animals. So we go, wow, we have the genes, we have their natural behavior, and we have the psychology studies we've run to look at cognition. And the question is, can we start putting them together to see which alleles predict what? And we're at the very beginning stages of this right now, but we're just starting to realize how naive it was to think that we're going to find some allele that's going to predict differences in our theory of mind studies or differences in some of our altruism studies. And I think that it sort of gets to the heart of what you were just saying, which is that the pathway is incredibly complex when we're dealing with, on trial 1, did my monkey Felix donate some food to the other guy, right? And we're trying to look at that from the level of which alleles Felix happens to have and so on. I think as we get more computational power and as we get more understanding of differences at the genetic level and how they translate, we'll be able to make some headway in it. But it's going to be a lot harder work than looking at a lot of the other biochemical pathways that we've figured out much more easily.
I'll altruistically donate my answer time to question.
The next one is from the audience. Again, this is another topic that comes up often in discussions of these matters, and that's the idea of and discovery of mirror neurons. Mm-hmm. Would you like to comment on that and what relevance they possibly might have to what we're talking about today? You might want to explain first what they are, right?
So mirror neurons are a set of neurons discovered by Rizzolatti and his colleagues that fire both when a recent monkey in this case is making an action, so monkeys are reaching for something, reaching for a pen, that also fire when they're watching an image of another monkey doing the same action. So the same neural tissue is firing when the monkey himself is making a motor action versus when he's watching somebody else do this. And there are many folks that think that this was one of the most important discoveries in neuroscience, and there's a lot of hope that it can tell us something really important about how altruism works, right? So if I, imagine if I had a set of neurons that both fired, when I stub my toe versus when I watch Felix stub my toe, or when I win a big monetary reward versus when Felix wins a big monetary reward, right? If the system translated from simple motor actions to an understanding of others and all this other stuff, then we might have a great set of neural mechanisms that might explain things like altruism and empathy and so on. And I think there's lots of excitement that these kinds of systems might be doing the work, but less empirical evidence just yet that they are. There's a lot of folks both in the primate side of things working with monkeys and in the human neuroscience things using techniques like fMRI and so on to try to see how much these systems are doing in that domain. And my guess is that the jury's still out. But conceptually, these systems clearly provide a potential mechanism for simulating your actions in the actions of somebody else. And the sad thing is I think we're just maybe 10 years behind the big answer to how much they're doing and how much of an impact they're having, not just in terms of motor actions and imitation, where I think we have good evidence that that set of neural systems might be what's doing the work, but in terms of the kinds of things Felix is doing, right, is the toddler recruiting mirror neurons to sort of watch Felix's action in terms of his goal and what he wants. I think it's a tempting conclusion, but one for which we don't have great empirical evidence just yet.
Right. Because we are affected by the other people's problems and so forth, this then turns into selfishness. And this is a little confusing. So because for some people, then the argument is, oh, altruism does not exist, which is problematic on two levels, because we, first of all, have to make the distinction between what sometimes people call biological altruism in terms of fitness, costs, and benefits, right? So this is totally irrelevant concerning that question. But secondarily, it might still be the very mechanism of all altruistic acts, and we have to ask the question, why in the first place is our brain designed in this way to be affected by other people's problems and so forth? So in the end, the fact that, for example, people take pleasure out of helping others, or that they are relieved when other people are no longer in pain or so forth, does not undermine our altruistic, the interpretation that these acts are altruistic, also on the proximate level.
The next question may sound strange, but there is actually a context within which it makes sense, in my opinion. The question is there any empirical evidence that human conscious thought affects prosocial behavior.
Interesting.
Now, it may sound strange because what do you mean? Of course it does. But in fact, there are some people that argue that conscious thought has nothing to do with what we do. It's with the consciousness is simply being aware of what we already decided to do. So.
Yeah. I mean, my guess is with all things that have to do with automatic processes versus conscious processes, it's going to be a complicated intertwining of both. But interestingly, there is new empirical evidence suggesting that when people are acting prosocially or altruistically, they often seem to be recruiting systems that are automatic, at least defined by being fast. So David Rand, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard, has some new evidence that you put people in these experimental economics games where they can decide to do the kind of altruistic thing, like donate to the public good or be selfish. And I think the interpretation was that the idea that we're these very selfish actors and we're sort of built to be selfish would suggest, well, the automatic processes are the thing that says, I'm going to keep the money, and then you have to recruit frontal lobes and be like, no, I'm a good person, I have moral standards here, I'm going to donate the money. Turns out the behavioral evidence is exactly the opposite. So if you look at people's fast decisions, so people who make fast decisions, presumably that rely more on automatic processes, those are the ones in which they're donating more to others, paying attention to others' rewards, and so on. If you look at the slowest processes, the ones that are kind of calculated and presumably tapping into conscious resources, those are the rational, self-interested kind of, those are playing economists. So you recruit frontal lobes and conscious processes to play economists. His interpretation is if you just let people behave automatically, those automatic things are surprisingly non-selfish. So I think this is new work, and it's some of the first stuff to start looking at this. But there are hints that what the approximate automatic mechanisms are telling us to do is to be nice. And it's only when we, take Econ 101, it's only when we sort of read Machiavelli and so on that we sort of put the brakes on that.
But I wonder, before you comment on this, so I presume this is new research, so I presume that it's culturally limited, meaning that it's done on the usual undergraduates at
my guess,
whatever, right?
Yep.
So it'd be interesting to see what happens in terms of conscious processing and how it interacts with the subconscious one.
Right.
If
and
you do the
it'd be
same
great
thing,
to do the
other
same
cultures.
thing developmentally, right? Because one of the things we know about automatic processes in adults, I, for example, drive automatically, but that's not because evolution built me to know how to drive a stick shift, right? It's because over my experience of driving, I've built in something that's really fast. If we really want to know what's fast and what's automatic, we have to go to Felix's lab and study the little kids and see how how they do things, what they do on their first instincts, and so on, and then see how that got changed over as perhaps little kids just got lots of practice being good because they were punished and reinforced every time they were bad. I mean, I don't think that that's the right explanation, but to really know empirically, we'd have to actually look developmentally.
I do think that I have a gene for stick shift driving, but anyway.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's my point. That also that this was initially more about online processing, but consciousness or explicit reasoning could also have a role in how people acquire certain norms or certain behaviors, and that's something that people sometimes forget, and developmental psychologists point out. And I'm a developmental psychologist, so I pointed it out.
I just hang out with a lot of psychologists.
The next question is, does xenophobia exist in non-human primates?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, and how does that work? Is it the result of learning experience? Is it innate? Is there even a way to tell?
Well, we could tell by doing relevant empirical tests of xenophobia in very young primates, which is tricky to do because most populations of primates don't include enough young individuals to do those tests correctly. But my guess is that xenophobia is a very old evolutionary trait. It's even, in some sense, you could even say it's more robust in other species because one of the spots where we see the most xenophobia in humans is when we take mild-mannered normal Americans who think they're not very xenophobic or prejudiced, and we put you in some sort of implicit task like IIT, as many of you might know about, and we show that when I'm implicitly measuring your categorizations, you categorize outgroups with things like warfare and violence and so on. You categorize in-group members with things like paradise and good and so on. For you, I have to trick you into doing this implicit test to sort of probe with this direct window into your automatic attitudes. But with non-human primates, my guess is if you could give them a survey, of our rhesus monkeys at the field site and ask, do you hate that other group across the way? They would say, yeah, I hate that other group. I would like to kill them. Like, I don't, they have no either demand characteristic qualms or conscious processes to shut that off. And it manifests in primates being really nasty to it. I mean, particularly in chimpanzees, where you actually see things like lethal raiding and, quote unquote warfare, where chimpanzees from one group will go to another group seemingly with the intent of causing harm to members of that other group, which has led to whole groups of chimpanzees being annihilated by members of neighboring groups. If you're interested in this stuff, definitely check out Richard Wrangham's book, Demonic Males, where he documents some of this stuff. And his hypothesis is that the evolution of male violence is sort of built into us to some interesting extent. And I think he'd strongly push the innate view. But I think, again, nobody's done the right studies, so the jury's probably still out on that.
Yeah, I mean, one comment is concerning altruism. Very often the claim is made, okay, the other animals do that, but we do it towards strangers. So that's another thing where it's not, where we have to assume that, yeah, these are, yeah, we should be xenophobic towards them. And that, I think this is very striking, and that's really interesting and very important. But I don't know to what extent it's important that non-human animals don't do it. Because we also always have to ask about the ecological validity of these things. So the case of chimpanzees, for example, they're no strangers, in my opinion. They're only neighbors, right? So there's always someone who's next door in the territory. I mean, chimpanzee groups have territories. They patrol territories, and what Laurie said, they attack sometimes and so forth. But they also integrate females. Right? That's another thing. So it's just not very general. So the one point is that there's just certain questions that we can ask concerning humans that we can't really ask about other animals.
So science is about data. It's about hypotheses. It's also about methods. And sometimes the devil is in the detail. And the next question gets to that. The question is, did the monkey altruism studies distinguish among effects due to sex, age, biological relatedness, and all these other things? Because that can get pretty complicated, right?
Yeah, and it's especially complicated given the other caveat I mentioned, which is that primate researchers are often limited in the kind of sample we can get. So while we can get hundreds of undergrads in, I have 10 capuchin monkeys in our enclosure back at Yale, and to look at all of these effects, I'm sort of limited by that sample size. But the good answer to this particular question, in case one of the reviewers is an audience, is that yes, in the existing capuchin monkey, at least studies of some of these donation tasks, folks have been able to show that individuals who were related did not necessarily donate more or less. They've only been done so far on same age individuals because most of the animals being tested are adults. But it does also happen across different sexes, and there was no sex differences either in terms of males and females overall donating more, or males donating more to females and vice versa. Those were the only kinds of effects we had enough power to look at. One of the nice things about the field is that there are at least a couple different labs looking at the same kinds of things, so we can kind of, even though I don't have many monkeys in my own facility, we can sort of pool across monkeys from Yale and monkeys from Rome and monkeys from Yerkes and other spots. But so far, we haven't seen any of those differences mattering. The one difference that does seem to matter in the monkey donation studies, though, is the monkeys group, which gets back to some of the xenophobia issues we were just talking about, which is that you'll see this pro-social behavior, in other words, donating the good food to a guy that's in your group. When the monkey recipient is a member of a different group, the monkeys just go to chance. So it's not that they're spiteful and try to hurt them, it's that they just don't care. They're just kind of not even processing the task anymore when it's a guy who's from a different group. This is some nice work by Franz de Waal and his colleagues that just got published. What does this mean about psychological mechanisms? Something we could talk about, but that's one thing that does seem to, one little methodological detail that seems to matter a lot.
Yeah, so concerning the studies on these helping behaviors in chimpanzees, I can say they're all genetically unrelated and show these behaviors. We never found an effect of sex, and also not of dominance. So it's not the case that the subdominant always helps a more dominant one. So that we can rule that out. With age, it's a similar constraint. Most of the chimpanzees we tested are juveniles. They're generally more interested in participating in these experiments. And then concerning young children, I haven't found gender differences in my helping studies, but now my students and I are more and more getting into studies on sharing, and there it seems like we do find gender differences in the direction of girls being a bit more pro-social. And age, obviously, that's the major question we are asking. And so the point is that we find these behaviors very early on in 14 to 18-month-old children. And so how it develops later on, we don't know yet, but we know that it develops very early, which is important information for us to rule out certain things like that children think about their reputation, so at least explicitly. I mean, we adults know, okay, when people see what we do, they might tell others and so forth, and to the best of our knowledge, a 14-month-old does not reason about these things. So that's why it's important. But an important further question in our work is to see how it changes over time, so that maybe, and that's my working hypothesis, at some point children will modulate their prosocial tendencies depending on whether someone is watching or not. So that at some point they realize that they can gain some positive reputation from being helpful, and they will take advantage of that.
Next question. Outside of parents and children situations, is there any non-human evidence of life sacrifice behavior?
Definitely, but with the qualification that the question asked about parents and children, but it didn't ask about kin. So I think more broadly you see, probably using kin selection mechanisms, that organisms are happy to give their life if their life is less costly than the benefit that's given to closely related kin. So I think it was the geneticist Haldane had the quote that I'd gladly give my life for 3 brothers or 9 cousins, and that's because the reproductive benefit of 3 brothers is you're more than 3 brothers are more related to yourself than you are to yourself. Do we ever see evidence of this stuff outside the context of kin selection? I think that would be a much more debated question. There's some evidence of something that looks close to, or behavior that's incredibly costly on the part of vampire bats. So vampire bats need to get blood meals to eat. That's what they eat, is they eat blood. But blood is often very hard to find. And so what a nice vampire bat might do to an individual who didn't get a blood meal is he would regurgitate some blood that he had found himself to the other guys. It's not giving up your life for another individual, but because blood is so valuable, I think it's, not sure the exact number, I think it's like in 60 hours they'll die if they don't have access to a blood meal. So it's incredibly costly for these guys to be doing that. That would be my best animal example of a non-kin behavior that looks incredibly nice and incredibly costly to the point of almost being life-giving. But again, even vampire bat behavior is one where they seem to be doing it to non-kin, but a lot of who they do it to is kin. So there are at least some biologists who think maybe it evolved to be for kin specifically, but sometimes non-kin are around and they just don't distinguish.
Well, there's also such a thing as reciprocal altruism. In those cases, they can be brought in, right? So they may be doing it simply because of a reasonable expectation that the thing is going to be returned
to them, right? But given so my guess is that that's the mechanism, but the idea is that the behavior is so costly that you could find yourself so quickly in a position that you were kind of screwed on the blood side of things and didn't get somebody. But again, that's not life-giving. Usually when we see animals giving their own life, probably the guys that are on them that are getting the benefit are closely related kin. I don't know offhand of any other life-giving behaviors that are for non-kin.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious about that concerning humans. I mean, there's always this example that people go out, soldiers jumping on a grenade and things like that. So if they're, do we know the reasons for that? I mean, okay, people risk their lives to protect their country, but very often they're drugged, or there is another line of soldiers with guns and who will shoot them if they don't go ahead, and so forth. So it's
or even the psychological mechanisms are there for defending your group, of which most of whom are kin, right? So that it could be that you see these psychological mechanisms playing out in a strange way, but it's only strange because these soldiers are in a situation that would be nothing like what they were typically in as hunter-gatherers, right? And there's psychology mechanisms, it's like the mechanisms we have for liking sugar that get tricked up by things like saccharin and so on. We didn't have that in our environment, so it would be stupid to build in a mechanism that was specific. This could be the same thing going on with the soldiers, where usually everybody around you is kin, so you want to take the grenade because probably there's 3 brothers sitting around, but in warfare, it's just a weird environment that trips you up.
The next question is a little tricky. What can you say about the idea of selfish genes and of its author, without getting personal? That would be Richard Dawkins.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think it was an amazingly important and influential idea, and I think it's mostly held up in the sense that we can explain a lot. So there was a time when we thought there were a lot of behaviors that we couldn't explain using the typical natural selection idea that you're working hard to increase your own individual fitness. But when And there were things like these, vampire bats who were giving their blood, or a ground squirrel who would give an alarm call and would die himself but save his kin. Before the idea of selfish genes, I think we didn't really have a great grasp of what was going on, but thinking that selection is acting at the level of the gene rather than the level of the individual has given us some insight into these kinds of strange cases. It was mostly people like Hamilton and others who did the hard work of figuring out this stuff in the biology world. I think Dawkins did a fabulous job of making it more popular for a wider audience and kind of getting folks to do it. So I think you wouldn't be able to say that Dawkins did all that work himself. It was the biologist who did it. But I think it's been an incredibly important idea and has explained a bunch of stuff that even perplexed Darwin that now we have a great grasp on.
Yeah, and one thing is also a warning for a lot of people seem to interpret the selfish gene as a gene for selfishness, right? That's not what is meant by that. And unfortunately, Dawkins has, I think it's in introduction, a part where he confuses this a little bit. So there is then the inference that because genes are selfish, we are acting selfishly. So this is the whole issue about differentiating proximate mechanism from ultimate function. And so yeah, I think this is very important to be able to look at different kinds of different levels of selection, and how even if deep down on a genetic level everything is selfish, altruistic behaviors, altruistically motivated behaviors can emerge.
So we have a few minutes to go. I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk for just briefly about whatever it is that excites you now. Because typically, the thing about scientists is, once the paper is published, this is old story. What are you guys doing now?
Yeah. So one of the questions I'm really interested in now has to do with something I mentioned earlier, which is this idea of theory of mind, right? How we get into the heads of other individuals. And one of the reasons I'm excited by it is because with theory of mind, we don't seem to be seeing the pattern that's often typical of what we see in primates, which is that when we go probe and when we go look, we might have some hypothesis that some aspect of our cognitive abilities is unique, but then when we actually look, we say, lo and behold, there's some interesting precursors there. In the case of theory of mind, we see tons of precursors in non-human animals, but there seems to be one spot where humans, in fact, do seem to be unique, and that is in our ability to represent others' beliefs. So other animals and other primates in particular, can think about what other individuals see and know and what they're ignorant of. This is good for them because it helps them deceive and so on. But they can't seem to think beyond that to represent others' beliefs. So to think that somebody thinks something that's incorrect or has an opinion that's different from them, as opposed to just kind of knows or doesn't know. And I'm excited by this in part because here's one spot where we're seeing differences, which is sort of the business that we're all in, right? It's to explain why we're here and no other species is doing the same thing we're doing. But I also think it might be that the fact that we do this and other species don't might powerfully explain the way that ideas translate across people and the power of other individuals' ideas. And I'll tell you one developmental study that interestingly looked at this. This was a study with very young 7-month-old human infants trying to ask whether other people's beliefs can affect these 7-month-old infants. And they were doing one of these tasks that infant researchers often use where they're trying to measure what babies know by surprising them. And they'll sort of show babies something that are surprising and see if babies look longer. So one of the tasks would be sort of, Felix and I watching this water bottle go behind the occluder, and then if I were to drop the occluder and the thing was gone, I would be surprised because I thought it was there and it wasn't there. Researchers have done this all the time and show that babies have some knowledge of physics. They know when things are there and not there. The interesting thing in this study was they added a condition where the baby knew where the object was, but there was some person who had a false belief about it. So the person was wrong. And what the researchers found was that babies were less surprised at something they knew to be false, something they knew to be surprising, when there was some other individual in the room that had a false belief. In other words, being around somebody that was wrong for these 7-month-old babies made them more okay with seeing the wrong outcome, made them less surprised about finding something that's wrong. And so this is totally exciting to me because it suggests not only might we be unique in having beliefs, we might also be unique in the extent to which we're affected by others' beliefs. And I think that has huge implications for cultural learning, for the importance of skepticism, and for the importance of idea transmission out there, and for really what it might mean to be uniquely human. And so we're doing lots of follow-ups to try to see, where do the monkeys fall short? What are they missing? We're now doing some collaborations with developmental psychologists to be like, wait, what's going on in these cases of humans where they're getting affected by others' beliefs? What are the constraints on that? And that's what I am super excited about at the moment, is figuring all this stuff out.
Good. Excellent. Yeah, so what I'm interested in at the moment is to try to connect what we know about young children with what we know about adults in the domain of cooperative behavior. So, for example, we know that we pay attention to whether we are interacting with someone who, over repeated interactions, cooperated with us or defected us. So we're engaged in reciprocal altruism. Or, as I mentioned before, we care a lot about our reputation, so that we're more inclined to act on behalf of others when people observe us than when we're not being observed, and so forth. And so the initial studies indicated that very young children have these helpful tendencies and share resources with others. And now what we are trying to investigate is when these other kind of factors that we know play a major role in adults begin to play a role in human ontogeny. And so for one example is reciprocal altruism, again, that you could argue that maybe this is all strategic from the start, right? That there's this assumption that I help you now and you will help me in the future. But it could also be that there's just this naive assumption that this will happen, and children are not really responsive to that. So that genetically, they're kick-started towards having altruistic inclinations, and then later on in ontogeny, they acquire the other kinds of mainly cognitive skills that make them be more selective. And so this is what we find, for example, that young children at 2.5 years of age, they will help and share even if the other person over and over again does not share back. And then around 3.5 years of age, they are responsive to that. So their tendency to share decreases over time when the other one never cooperated back. And so these are things that I find really exciting at the moment. And so this is one of these cases where we know a lot about what should be the case. So there are these normative models about what is a good strategy to engage in cooperative behaviors and not violate the assumptions of natural selection. And one is, for example, reciprocal altruism. Or that it's a more complex version of that, it goes via the group, or indirectly, or indirect reciprocity, that it's not only the dyadic interaction over repeated interactions into the future, but that we are a social, we have to take care about our social persona and might prevent ourselves from positive future social interactions if we're not nice to others because other people are watching, and so forth. And so this is the point, that there are these theoretical models that we know are effective, but we don't know to what extent they actually play a role. And there's a lot of evidence about that they do play a role in human adults, but we don't know much about their ontogenetic origins, and that's what we're trying to investigate.
Okay, we're about to wrap it up, so let us thank again Laurie Santos and Felix Warneken for their time.
Yeah, that was fun.